Hello and welcome. I am Jennifer Matthews, Associate Professor at Oakland University in Michigan and a proud ADAC board member. Today, I have the distinct pleasure to moderate our second session, Collective Mourning and Healing with Dr. Rita Milbourne-Dobson and Chris Hall. This session will focus on collective grief and healing practices from a social justice lens. Dr. Rita Milbourne-Dobson is the Director of Precious Gems Supportive Services in Glenside, Pennsylvania, as well as a part-time lecturer for Drexel University Department of Medicine. Mr. Chris Hall is the Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Centre for Grief and Bereavement, a government-funded specialist bereavement service, which is based in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. He is also a past president of ADAC. To frame our conversation, Chris and Rita, can you share about your respective backgrounds and social issues that evoke collective grief and mourning in your communities?
Chris, you want to go first?
Happy to. Well, I guess there are a couple. There are many social issues. Obviously, at the moment, COVID, which is still unfolding. I guess two that come to mind would be reconciliations with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, the first inhabitants of this country, and the generational trauma that's resulted from colonialisation of Australia would come to mind immediately. I think the other, and again dovetailing with the previous session, is the impact of bushfires on Australia. We're certainly one of the most flammable countries in the world. I think of the last 5 major bushfires, 2 of those have been in Australia, one a little while ago with 173 deaths. So for me, clearly there's a distinct relationship between bushfires and what's happening in terms of our planet. And in fact, bereaved people are one of the strongest advocates for action on climate change in the country. So I guess there are 2 that come to mind immediately when we start thinking about the idea of kind of collective grief.
It's interesting you would say climate change, because as I have worked in my community, the issues that were social justice focused for us were healthcare, equal access to healthcare, education, law enforcement. But more recently, I have some friends who are from Michigan, and Flint, Michigan specifically. And so as we talked about this social justice theme for them, social justice was dealing with clean water, something that is not in my normal vocabulary when I talk about social justice. But here in Philadelphia right now, social justice issues are definitely around law enforcement and the incredibly high rate of murder that we have in our city at this present time.
I'm hearing from both of you these structural systems that really impact the ability for people to have healing and to be able to grieve. Can you talk a little bit more about reconciliation, whether it's in terms of the bushfires and Aboriginal individuals, and or Rita, for you mentioned people within your community dealing with healthcare, law enforcement?
Rita, would you like to go first?
Yeah, well, okay, well, now it's my turn. Okay. Well, for me, with very prominent in Philadelphia right now is with law enforcement. About a year ago to this date, we had a gentleman who was having a mental health crisis. His family called on law enforcement to help with the gentleman. At that particular time, the officers did not have tasers on them. And the man had a knife in his hand. And the police shot him 14 times in front of his mother and other community members. Flash forward to today, because of that incident, now we have funding in Philadelphia for all law enforcement officers to have tasers, which is something that you think that should have happened before, but it didn't happen. But because of protests and social justice issues being raised, this has happened. But healthcare wise, with COVID, as we're talking about it, a lot of conversation was held. A lot of people of the brown and Black communities were deeply impacted by COVID, high mortality rates, and especially here in Philadelphia. And so the theme song that kept going out, the narrative was, they don't trust the healthcare system. And so some of us got together and thought about that narrative and how we can change that narrative to, okay, they don't trust the healthcare system because the healthcare system has done such in the past, and having that kind of conversation. So when, lots of times we talk about mistrust, people go to Tuskegee, the Tuskegee study, but there's so many more examples in modern day. And so just having that dialogue, why people don't trust, can make such a big difference. And so what happened in Philadelphia, we have a doctor here who was doing something totally different, who was really impacted by the fact people were dying at such a high rate. And she herself, out of her own money, started a consortium called Black Doctors Consortium, which started COVID testing and COVID vaccinations in those communities. And because they did that, people started trusting more, and it began a reconciliation process within the city healthcare for people realizing that there were disparities and doing something, being proactive about doing something with it.
And it sounds like that's a long-term initiative, which oftentimes is part of the problem, that there are short-term initiatives. You mentioned Flint. When it first happened, it was all over the news and it just really died down, no pun intended, but it really, it just wasn't as prominent and still isn't.
Right.
So I'm glad that you brought that up. Thank you. Chris, you were gonna add on some more?
Yeah, I guess to understand any act of reconciliation, one needs to understand history. And in terms of the experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the story, I'm sure, resonates with many First Nation experiences. But in terms of a very brief history, I guess, in 1770, when James Cook claimed ownership of the east coast of Australia on behalf of Great Britain, that claim was based on this concept of terra nullius, or the land of nobody. So it meant in effect that according to British law, Australian Indigenous population had no legitimate claim to the land in which they'd lived for at least 65,000 years. And so before 1967, Aboriginal people weren't counted in the census as people. Dogs, cats and sheep were counted in Australia before Aboriginal people were. In 1992, the High Court recognised the traditional rights of Aboriginal people and that native title existed for all Indigenous people. So this terra nullius idea became a legal fiction. Although we know in that interim time there were massacres of Aboriginal people, poisonings of Aboriginal people, and from the mid-1800s through to the 1970s, so in our recent history, Aboriginal children were removed from their families through government policies, and these are referred as the stolen generations. They were taken by the police from their homes, on their way to and from school, placed in over 480 institutions, adopted or fostered by non-Indigenous people, subjected to abuse. And there are still more than 17,000 stolen generation survivors in Australia. So in 2008, the Australian Prime Minister, on behalf of all Australians, made a formal apology to Australia's Indigenous people, particularly to the stolen generation. And I think the striking image for me was of seeing people gathered outside our parliament weeping and holding up the photos of parents. So this kind of recognition of what Aboriginal people call sorry business, or which is their term really for bereavement, was both a symbolic act, but the the differences in life expectancy, the deaths in police custody, which are still, significant and profound issues for Aboriginal people. Ordinarily, if I was presenting anywhere, I would start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land upon which I live. And for me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their ancestors, past, present, and emerging. So a very deliberate statement of an acknowledgement of that very long history. And again, that's a complex and unfolding story, and it's in one sense, it's not my story to tell. It's the story of Aboriginal people to tell. But this is obviously a deep and continuing wound in terms of inequality and access to full life within this country.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned two things.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Rita.
Chris was saying how complex it is, and that acknowledgement and talking about it, and it's so simple but yet so complex once again, because right now in our country right now, having that discussion is causing a great deal of pain for people. The history. We don't want to talk about the history. We want to talk about a form of history. And that all kinds of debates are happening in school systems about what we should teach our children about our history, and things that aren't as nice about our history. And so I'm just intrigued by the fact there was some sort of an apology and just a simple acknowledgement that did exist.
Yeah, I think reconciliation is obviously about strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Indigenous people. But I think any reconciliation has elements of truth-telling, of justice, of forgiveness, of healing, of reparation, and also love. And I think they're core features about, again, picking up on the early discussion in the first panel, the athletic listening, that Yiddish expression that God gave us, one mouth and two ears, and we should use them in those proportions, that we actually listen deeply and fully to the experience of others, this adopting a position of curiosity, of not knowing, moving away from, I remember the days I used to get requests for somebody sending a fax, a one-page fax on how Aboriginal people grieve, which was, of course, a nonsense. And how do we actually listen to the individual experience, that although we might talk in collective terms, everybody has their own unique history, experience, and story to tell, and not to make assumptions about what that might be or what the most difficult part of that story might be.
Mm-hmm. I like that. I like the idea of having, first of all, those that have been impacted, that they have a voice, that they have a space to share, to tell their story. And then just the parallels between your country of Australia and then the United States. When we were talking and kind of preparing for this, we were talking about the first peoples within our country, the United States, and the boarding schools and removing of individuals. And then obviously many other people who have been minoritized have experienced atrocities. Can you all speak a little bit more about how reconciliation is a verb? That's what I'm hearing you both say, that it's not just a one-time statement, but it's an ongoing action.
When the George Floyd killings and had a big impact on this collective grief and social justice, and people started listening to one another to some degree, but then it stopped. What people started doing was taking down statues, and then we went to the pancake box and Uncle Ben's rice, And it's like, okay, but still, I go back to Flint, Michigan again. They don't have clean water still. So what does that do of anything? And so many times there's a cry for to do something, and the rage is mobilized, and the issues that are focused on are really not the issues. We're still not dealing with those issues because they are so complex. And so it's like a form of tokenism. Well, I'll do this. Everyone should be happy with that. And we should all get along now. And it's not that simple. We really have to listen to the stories. Even if we don't understand the stories, if we don't agree with the stories, we have to listen to the stories and just step back for a minute. Just step back for a minute and listen. You know, the Me Too movement, you know, it was interesting because on social media, people were telling their stories, me too, me too, me too. And it seemed for me, almost everyone in my network, female, was saying me too. They had this experience. And it wasn't listened to before because it was just the way it was done. But it gave a voice to people to come out and say that they were assaulted. And so that makes a difference. Listening to people's story just makes such a big difference.
Yeah,
Hearing too, not minimizing, not dismissing, not invalidating.
Yeah, an example would be in terms of this, Aboriginal, the apology to Aboriginal peoples. Some felt that this was historical. I don't bear any personal responsibility. It wasn't me that did these things, so I think for many it is certainly about education, having an understanding, and having a kind of a personal and intimate understanding of what has happened. But I think it also operates on economic levels in terms of economic disadvantage, access to health, education, of not providing kind of Western solutions, truly empowering people to make choices about their lives and to be supported in that, rather than again looking at a response through our own particular frame of reference, which we may not be even terribly aware of. But again, I think it's really about partnership. It's about deep engagement, and it's about really an exchange of power. It's about changing that power relationship.
In Philadelphia, of course, we went to virtual learning during the pandemic. And so, okay, virtual learning, most of the children didn't have notebooks. So someone said, okay, we'll get notebooks for everyone. So they devised a system, give Chromebooks to everyone, which was wonderful. One small problem, they didn't have the internet. And so these are continuing problems, and they're wondering, why don't they have the internet? Because they couldn't afford the internet. And so once again, putting children back further and further. So it took a collective, collaborative effort to identify the problem and then do something with it. And now it's running smoothly because someone actually took action and did something there.
I, as the two of you are discussing it sounds like the lack of acknowledgement, the lack of reconciliation adds to the grief experience of people who are minoritized and marginalized. And so there's this cumulative grief that's occurring with not having this acknowledgement. I'm wondering, as we're talking about collective grief, I'm wondering how we can frame this conversation also in bridging into collective healing, and what that might look like for the communities that you serve.
Once again, I keep going back to the same word, acknowledging, just acknowledging once again, that's very important there. But panels like this and others where people come and actually have dialogue, open dialogue, being able to take this tough stuff, to hear the tough stuff, to say this tough stuff, and then say, okay, what's next? I find that many of us aren't willing to listen to the tough stuff. we were taught, when I went to school, we were taught about America, the great melting pot, and assimilation. And I often hear that we're more alike than we're different. And that, well, may be true, but we are different. And so acknowledging that we are different and being different is okay. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's like, oh, okay. Never thought of that before. I do support groups. I'm mostly with children, but the last 2 years since COVID, been working on Zoom with an Irish Catholic community. Between you two of all of us, I'm not Irish, I'm not Catholic. And yet we found that common bond of grief and bereavement. And we would talk about different funeral practices and rituals that we had. And they would often say to me, oh, we would never do that. And I would say, we would never do that. From us talking and sharing with one another, some of them have taken some of those practices into their own traditions now. And we laugh because some of them have never had, most of the funeral homes that are not African American, they don't have an organ in the funeral home. And so now they're bringing musicians in and they're loving that. Now the churches, Christian churches, they don't like the incense thing. They don't like that whatsoever, sage, they don't like any of that. But the funeral homes are allowing sage and incense. And so when a group comes back, they share about different other cultural things they've incorporated, and they smile about it, and it just helps bridge some of that gap that we have. And that's simple.
Yeah, I think, again, running a government-funded national bereavement service, I think one of the things that's worth doing is doing an audit and to see to what extent is the support that you're providing to people representative of the population. And we undertake that, and it's clear that it's not. And so how do we do that? We work with other organizations, we empower and support other organizations. They may be cultural specific organizations to provide support to their own communities, but we also need to reflect on our own practice. To what extent are we serving a white, middle class, affluent population who are able to navigate a complex healthcare system, who are able to access telehealth services. And so I think we need to look at the fundamental building blocks of an organization or a practice to see, to what extent are we reflecting the real world? And if we're not, then we need to take some responsibility for that. Many organizations in Australia have what's called a reconciliation action plan. And this looks at a whole range of things: educating staff, providing opportunities to develop strong and deep relationships with Aboriginal organisations, building the capacity of other organisations to support themselves, providing scholarships for Aboriginal practitioners to be able to provide bereavement care. But I think importantly, auditing what we teach. And I think, much of what we teach is very much through, I often think about the origins of this field. It's largely the experience of white, middle-aged Christian North American and British women whose husbands had died. And, to what extent do we hear those other stories? To what extent do we hear stories of people of colour, of diversity, of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans clients? And so I think we need to do some hard self-examination and ask some difficult questions of ourselves. To what extent do our structures perpetuate these injustices, and what can we do, not just as an individual, but as an organisation, like ADEC, in terms of addressing these fundamental structural deficiencies that exist around the world?
One of the trainings that most people on jobs hate to go to is cultural competency, or what is it we call it? We go diversity training. Oh, geez. And what generally happens, they have the person who is the minority teach about whatever. And we all sit there and nod and go back to our same old ways. And so they're really that listening component. It's like you're telling that same old story again. I've heard many times people say, "Oh my goodness, you're bringing race into it again." Um, yes, because it is there all the time. When I walk into a room, it's there. It's obvious I'm other. Other could be so many different things. And so let's just talk about it. But we really the training, I'm loving that you're auditing your training, Chris. I'm loving that. But we do the training, and what we do, I'm saying I've been in management before. We check on the box, training, yes, completed. We make people sign the paper that they completed the training, and that's the end of it. And that's why we're in the dilemma now, because that's the end of it.
Mhm. And so there's this intentional practice of cultural competency from what I'm hearing you both say, that there has to be a deliberate practice of changing, of self-awareness from an organizational level, really addressing assumptions and biases so that there can be really intentional inclusion. A couple of questions have come through, and I'm open to putting those out there now if the two of you are open.
Sure.
Okay, one question was, how far do you consider that these historic inequalities and marginalizations have shaped dominant professional assumptions about what grief looks like and what healthy grief consists of?
Well, I think just go back to my earlier point. I think, historically and still to a large extent, these are individualistic, psychological, intrapsychic, often pathology focused orientations. I'm making generalizations here. They tend to be secular. So when we think of things such as Aboriginal spirituality, the extent to which we incorporate those within with our major frames, there's no question that much of what we teach is coming from the US and the UK primarily. It's primarily coming from English language speakers. So I think absolutely, there's certainly, I don't think in my mind any doubt that these dominant frameworks really haven't allowed perhaps the space for a deeper examination of power and power imbalances, and also cultural diversity.
But also included with that is a spiritual component. We talk about denial a lot. And so people in my community often will bring spirituality into the conversation and talk about God and God healing and not accepting the report of the doctor. There's a scripture that talks about whose report will you believe? And it says, I will believe the report of the Lord. And so people will often say that back to a healthcare professional, and they say, oh my gosh, these people are crazy. They're in denial. Whereas it's not denial. Their faith teaches them to talk a certain type of language, and that's part of their faith language. They see their loved one is dying. They know that, and yet they speak something different because that's what their culture says is what you speak. And so we tend to, I've been on both sides of it. I've been in the healthcare field, and I watch my colleagues say, how people are in denial, and they call in psychiatrists sometimes, or psychologists, a counselor to speak to the family. And so I often have to try to explain to them, they're okay, they get it. They're not going to say those words that we want them to say, but they get it, and just respect their religious framework. That's their coping style. And so we have to be aware of what is spiritual language and people's coping styles, and not pathologize it. Because once again, that starts unbuilding a bridge that you may have had from the beginning. So you have to listen to that.
I mean, what comes to mind is a story someone told me of a remote rural hospital where there was an Aboriginal man dying, and so his family and clan gathered on the front of the the hospital grounds because they wouldn't let more than one person in, and they were playing music. They were literally singing him home, to use their language. And the response was for the hospital administration to ring the police, that they were being disruptive and please remove them off the ground. So again, even the extent to which physical structures prevent cultural practices. Smoking ceremonies, for example, the extent to which those things might be allowed. So I think these are fundamental kind of structural problems that often prevent people from fully engaging with the cultural and ritual practices, particularly end of life.
What was some of the nicer? I was in an inner city hospital, and we had a large Hispanic population, and so because of that, the hospital began to understand when they would come in and say, "Who are you? We want specific relationships." They would say, "Oh, familia, family." And next thing you know, it was 25 people, and so the hospital was really very accommodating at end of life, and I really appreciate them for doing that. It was a Jewish institution, and they realized this is very important to have the La Familia, everyone there in the room, and they allowed that. Now, I fast forward to another place, and they said 2 people, and meant 2 people, and that's it. And they wanted to make sure you were blood related. In African-American culture, we often have play family and play mothers and play sisters. The hospital wanted play nothing. They wanted blood people, and that was it. And often people were left out of that collective grief process.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, Rita, the melting pot, and how, that just really negates, both of you are providing examples of how diversity within cultures is so important, and how we really need to have more of accommodation, and not in an intentional way, that we are integrating people's practices and beliefs into their grieving and mourning experience. One question that came out, it was, can you address the more personal, community affected, the community neighborhood tragedy, the family, the school, the group of teens, the faith community when a tragic death occurs? What are some of your thoughts about that you might not have already touched on?
Unfortunately, for me right now, that's just about a daily occurrence. We've had over 450 homicides in the city this year, and it's just really overwhelming. But what's happened is because of COVID, people are grieving differently. That collective grief that's there, some people are scared to come out. They're scared to go past houses, and some of the things that were done in the past aren't done anymore. Funeral homes are still limiting the amount of people that can come to a service. And on a very personal note, my mother died June 2020. So she was, COVID was in its swing, wasn't a vaccine yet, but we were fortunate enough that a church let us have a service for her. My mother's greatest fear when COVID happened, which is no one's fear with this, she would say, "You don't want to die now because you can't have the kind of funeral you want to have." I'm thinking, who's saying that kind of thing? But that was really important to her. And so we were able to have a service with our immediate family, which was really 75 people, which was a blessing, as opposed to my father who had 3,000 people. Okay. So but still, it was just so restrictive. And so it's restrictive still. And so people aren't able to really have that collective grieving, collective mourning that they had before. In my own faith tradition, we had 30 bishops die in the first months of COVID. 30 bishops, not local pastors, but national bishops die. And every day they would send out a notice, "We will remember them at a later date. Because of COVID, we can't do X, Y, and Z." And so they weren't acknowledged. And to this day, we still haven't done that thing yet. So that's how it impacts.
I think you always see enormous diversity, enormous diversity in families and communities following following events. And I think, as it's often been said, a lot of good therapy is good grief education in terms of talking about things such as, grieving styles and what they mean, different expressions. I think what I often see is this incredible cohesiveness that sometimes exists in communities after a disaster, but is unsustainable as the differences become more apparent. You've got those who want to put it behind them and look to the future, others who are still very much preoccupied by that loss and engaged with us. We see that politically in terms of what the political tolerance is for support following large-scale events, and the media as well in terms of the attention they might give an event and how long it might take them to move to something else. But I think there's always opportunity, positive and negative opportunities. I've spoken to people who have had the experience of being a participant of a Zoom funeral at home. A number of men I've spoken to who felt that in fact they could be more emotionally authentic in the privacy of their own home. They felt more tearful. They felt more connected than they would have felt if they were actually in the room. And so I think we kind of see some interesting differences in the way people deal with loss, in the same way we're seeing these differences with telehealth. Perhaps some of the concerns around the use of telehealth haven't been fully realised, and that many people have found that powerfully effective and in some ways far more accessible for those who live some distance away from services. So I think that the challenge is dealing with the difference often, and the meaning that's ascribed to those differences in the way people respond to any loss.
I like that we've highlighted both ends of the spectrum, how it can be further marginalizing and restrictive for some communities, but for other people, it also can be a way to really connect more, having that integration of technology. I do want to just thank our participants. We've gotten a lot of great comments and feedback in our chat. So I want to acknowledge that some of you have shared some personal reflection. So thank you. And there has been a lot of gratitude with the examples that both you, Chris, and Rita have shared. We've talked about grief as a political act, as something that is a verb that you're doing. And so a question has come out: while dialogue is important, it can only go so far as it is mostly based on the cognitive, and language can be very limiting. What are some other ways to close the social distance between people that can lead to deepened understanding and collective healing? What are the arts?
Well, I guess part of the construct I use is a kind of a health promotion one, that there are things that can be done upstream that can prevent harm downstream. And sometimes they're very little things. Again, moving us perhaps up somewhat away, some distance away from what we've been talking about. But what comes to mind is one example of where people were receiving death certificates and notices from the coroner's court, and they would come in the mail. People would open them and often be quite distressed. And so a very simple thing to do was to actually double envelope that. And so when they opened it, they had some control. They said, this envelope contains a death certificate. You may want to open this with a friend, your general practitioner, or they had our centre's number. They could ring our number. So it gave people choice. It gave them a sense of control over where and when and who they might have with them. I mean, that's a very simple thing, but it was a way of preventing unnecessary distress. The way financial institutions deal with bereaved people, it can be far more humane than it often is. The way police might deal with things such as death notifications, the way we talk to people about loss. I think there are lots of things we can do if we listen carefully to the experience of bereaved people, what are those points of pain? What are those things that we can change quite simply? And often that is about a sense of being disempowered. It may be about somebody being distressed about a particular phrase that's used in a coronial report. Well, set up processes so that there is some discussion about that. Can that be changed? Creating dialogue between all those other kinds of institutions as well. So I guess that's what kind of comes to me. Are there things that we can do perhaps simply that can reduce the unnecessary distress? And as others have said, most of the problem that bereaved people have are social problems. It's the inability or unwillingness of people or systems to extend to them care. So I think we need to be watchful for what are those sorts of trigger points that create unnecessary pain.
I think the faith communities have really been hit with the inability to have these services and the collective time of grief and mourning. In my tradition, it's common for when the death is, people know of the death, people come over with fried chicken, potato salad, greens, all kinds of stuff. It's too much, so much food, so much fellowship. Now that people don't come over, they barely call. It's almost like they're afraid to even call you on the telephone. And then they may or may not come past a viewing. They're afraid to come to a viewing if they're having a viewing. And so that connection is lost, and the people feel disconnected with their faith as well. And so this has caused a problem in some faith communities as they want to come back into the building. People feel they were neglected during their time of grief. People forget that it was a pandemic, and it was intentional that we weren't meeting, but they forget that piece of it. They just remember that their loved one died and there was no service. It was very little contact from the faith community. And so they're disenfranchised at this point as well. In the city here, a few churches have been intentional, and one pastor has a television ministry, and he went on and apologized to members who he may have forgotten. And so he made the staff intentionally go back to every member or family member who had died in 2020, send a picture in or give us their name. And they put their name on the screen, and they had a special song, and they just played it. It was about 15 to 20 minutes, which took into the so-called church time, but they gave people that space to acknowledge that. And so what he has done now from this point on is every month, at the end of the month, he has a list of people who have died. And so the families feel they're connected and that they're remembered. And that makes a big difference for them.
Again, these intentional practices of helping people feel acknowledged. We've talked about that acknowledged piece of part of reconciliation, but having that acknowledgement makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think this, we often talk in terms of, there's a time in the future for this ritual of memorialization to happen. There's no statute of limitations on grief. And to find ways that actually can happen, that can be acknowledged, I think that's a promise that we need to keep with people, that in the enormity of the numbers of deaths as a result of COVID, that the individual human story isn't lost. That we find opportunities when possible to create that space to honor that life.
And technology has gone a far way in facilitating that. Related to technology, a question was, with COVID and relevant restrictions, people are now using more digital ways to engage in funeral rituals, which we've been talking about, even using gamification. What are your thoughts about this? Thoughts about gamification?
What was the last one?
Thoughts about gamification. So using games, I'm assuming video games and interactive games to engage in the mourning process.
I think that's already been happening for some time. There is actually a number of examples where players in multiplayer platforms have organized online, rituals and memorials for players who they in fact may never have met in person, but there's a real relationship there. I certainly think technology has changed, I think, fundamentally and in many ways irreversibly, the way we provide care and the way that can be used, creatively. So I think, in terms of new media, I think there's enormous opportunities now. I might be seen as a bit of a technology Luddite, but I certainly think in terms of younger people who are very, very comfortable with those sorts of modalities and live very, very much in the brief video experience, that there's lots of opportunities for leveraging technology.
I know years ago, the thought of someone having a funeral on any kind of social media was like horrifying. And now it's almost the standard of practice. And so in my community, as I say often, they're having a funeral and someone said, are they streaming it? Are they streaming it? And so people of all ages, not just the younger ones, older people are liking that too, Chris. They don't have to come out and they can sit in their house and just watch it and be a part of it still. And so, but there's pros and cons to everything. It takes away some of that personal touch, of course, that's missing. And of course, initially there were some issues with, Zoom bombing and things like that. But I personally feel that when people are talking more about death and dying and grief support, I think that's a good thing, because we're so death denying that I think any chance we get to people who are talking about it is can be good, can be a learning experience. That's my feeling.
And it's part of this collective mourning. And so a couple of comments regarding the gamification. It includes video games, RPG, Animal Crossing, multiplayer gaming communities sometimes hold online funerals and mourning rituals as well. Thank you.
Nice,
for these
nice.
I was at
comments.
my daughter's, she's 28, last night, and she was showing me her Animal Crossing world, and within that she'd created a grave for her godmother who died suddenly and unexpectedly, and it was an extension of her world, and and she'd put great care into this grave marker. So there's certainly lots of ways that people can express their love through this technology.
Nice.
It makes me also think about individuals that have disenfranchised grief. It can be empowering, actually, to use these different media to grieve and to mourn. We're getting close to the end, so I want to get in some of these last questions and then give both of you an opportunity to have some closing remarks. There's a question regarding, let's see, have either panelists seen what mortuaries have done to create that experience of loss? Any particular thoughts about that?
For me, they've been just trying to keep up, because there's been so many deaths. Things maybe they're different now, but in the beginning, I know the crematory near me, he couldn't take anybody else because there were so many people, and it definitely was an in and out type of thing, and you couldn't really worry about people grieving. It's time for the next one. And so I've been to many funeral homes during this time, and for the most part, I haven't seen anything concrete put in to assist with this process. Let's be very honest, I haven't seen anything. They feel that they give you Zoom, so that's kind of it.
Sure.
From what I see. I don't know if it's different for you, Chris.
We've had, I think, I don't know what the latest numbers are, but it's probably 1,800 deaths as a result of COVID in Australia. So, and many of those in the early phase were in aged care facilities. More recently, it's been younger people. But no, I've not got any particular insights in terms of mortuary or the funeral or sector.
Mhm. Mhm. And someone commented about drive-by rituals with a multitude of losses within family neighborhoods as another occurrence that has been newer, I would say, as a result of the pandemic. As we're ending our conversation about reconciliation, there was a question regarding veterans of the Vietnam War that were not acknowledged when they returned in the 70s. And it's been an elephant in the room of this participant's family. Suggestions on reconciliation practices in this instance, and perhaps as you're both responding to this, you can provide some last comments about our topic today.
Phew. I really have to think about that one a little longer. That's really something that I've not really thought about.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the general idea that good ritual arises from a story, and so by getting an understanding of the story, being able to create some ritual that acknowledges that reality, and also seeking support and validation from others would be my kind of initial thoughts there. Yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of a closing thought, as I mentioned earlier, I think these discussions really are discussions about how we come to pain. How do we come to pain in ourselves, in each other, and the wider world? And so I think we need to be prepared to hear the story of pain, to acknowledge the loss as real and authentic, and also to the extent that we can, join with people in a deeper understanding of their experience, and always be mindful of what are those kinds of upstream structural divides that exacerbate and make more difficult the lives of bereaved people. And I think the other thing is to maintain a sense of optimism. I think sometimes the level of injustice, the level of pain, can be absolutely overwhelming. And so I think to maintain an optimistic and resilient approach, as you often are battling complex and large systems. So keep the faith, I guess.
Thank you, Chris. Rita, how about for you?
Just a closing thought, panels like this and other opportunities where people get to talk and get to listen. I think that is so important, and it gives, even though it's uncomfortable, as I said before, it gives people opportunity to grow. And I have this quote I keep in my office. It says, his name is James Cash Penny, says that growth is never by mere chance. It's a result of forces working together. And that's what we have to do. We're saying verbally that we want to make a change and we want to be inclusive. Once again, intentionality is so important, and working together, even when it is uncomfortable, but working together is important.
A lot has been talked about today: acknowledgement, reconciliation, giving voice. And for the questions that we did not get to regarding terminally ill individuals, and then the question regarding individuals that are veterans of the Vietnam War, having that acknowledgement and giving voice to their experience. I really do want to thank both you, Chris and Rita, for this timely and much needed discussion. And I want to thank all those that have participated. Great comments in our chat. We are inviting you to complete a brief 4-question survey, which will take about 2 minutes. We appreciate your feedback in this. Thank you, and we'll see you in our next panel, Compassion Fatigue and Resilience with Doctors Andy Ho, March Vachon, and Shang Quang Hang.